Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue pour cette quatrième et dernière conférence du Colloque Wright 2014 dédiée à l'exploration des secrets du Soleil. Quelques petites informations pratiques. Vous avez reçu des petits billets sur lesquels vous êtes invités à écrire vos questions, qui seront ramassées par des hôtesses à la fin de la conférence du professeur Nocera. Il y aura ensuite, à la fin de cette conférence, une petite pause de 5 minutes qui permettront à ceux qui voudront nous quitter de le faire. Par contre, bien sûr, ceux qui aimeraient écouter les réponses à leurs questions sont priés bien sûr de rester dans la salle. Il y aura à peu près une vingtaine de minutes dédiées justement à aux réponses à ces questions. La manifestation devrait se terminer autour des 20 heures. Je vous rappelle également qu'il y a, en plus de ces conférences, un spectacle Soins et Lumière qui a lieu au parc Unibastion tous les jours, et ce jusqu'au 23 novembre, 3 fois par soirée, 17h45, 19h et 20h30. J'aimerais maintenant passer la parole au professeur Alan Williams, professeur de chimie à l'Université de Genève, qui va présenter le conférencier de ce soir, le professeur Daniel Nocera.
Mesdames, Messieurs, bonsoir. Pour vous habituer à l'anglais, je vais faire la présentation dans cette langue. As tonight we will be talking about the effect of the sun as a source of energy, I would just like to let you think for a few minutes about the history of solar energy. For about 2 billion years, life on Earth used the sun as effectively the sole source of energy. It worked very well. About 200 years ago, we started using fossil fuels, but we now know that if we look to the future, in about 200 years, oil and gas will be exhausted. Coal and tar sands will carry on for about 1,000 to 2,000 years. And we learned earlier this week that the sun will keep shining for another 8 billion years. So for those who are planning a long-term investment, solar energy is definitely worth looking at seriously. The problem with solar energy is not that it's not there, it is that we do not yet know how to exploit it efficiently. And one of the most eminent researchers in this field is our speaker this evening, Professor Daniel Nocera, who I will introduce to you briefly. He was born in Boston. He got his first degree at Rutgers University in New Jersey, then moved to Caltech to work in the laboratory of Professor Harry B. Gray. Immediately after his PhD, he was appointed to be a professor at Michigan State University. In 1997, he moved to MIT, and in 2012, he moved to, not very far, but to Harvard University, where he is now a professor of energy. Energy is therefore his main interest in life, although as a trained chemist, he is using chemical approaches to solve some of the problems. In 2006, he wrote what I found a remarkable paper entitled Powering the Planet, Chemical Challenges in Solar Energy Utilization. This paper has been cited 1,600 times, if I understand correctly, and if you read it, you will see why. His work is, apart from its scientific excellence, is based on systems which can be developed on a large scale at low cost and which work reliably. Now, this is very important if you want to use this technology in countries which do not already have, or regions which do not already have a well-developed infrastructure. And this aspect of his interest, I think, is particularly interesting. He's been working considerably with India, which has been honored by his election to the Indian Academy of Sciences. He has a number of distinctions. I won't read them all because that would certainly take too long. But to give you some idea, he has over 350 papers, over 100 research students. He's a member of the US Academy of Arts and Science and of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. So I hope that has been enough to give you an appetite to hear what he has to say. I'm certainly looking forward to it.
So thank you, Alan, and thank you, George, and the Wright Foundation, which is very lucky to have the University of Geneva as their partners, because this, and I have to say, I've done a few of these things before. It takes an enormous amount of time. And the professors of this university have been very gracious this week in hosting all of us. And I'm pretty sure they're going to be happy to see us go so they can get back to work. But we'll see. So today, what I want to talk about is this idea, and I'm calling it the Sustainocene. When you're at MIT, you can just be a nerd, just a scientist, an engineer. But then when you move to Harvard, they expect all these other things. So I decided I would start a new epic in humankind. And I'm calling it the Sustainocene. And I'll tell you where that comes from in a minute. To understand that, and this overlaps with a lot that you've heard this week, first you have to know what epoch you're living in. And so you've been living in an epoch called the Holocene, which means recent whole. And that's been for the last 10,000 years. And at that point, there weren't many of us on the face of the planet. There weren't that many people. And so we couldn't alter Earth's systems. And so this is a true geological epoch. But since the 1970s, you hear a new word, and the new word is called the Anthropocene. And what that means is that there's so many of us on the planet that we've begun to alter Earth's systems. And last night you heard Jerry talk about some of the ways we're altering Earth's systems. And so that is how we live now. This is a new word, but you can see from the pictures. I spend a lot of time on Google getting pictures that are evocative of my message. So you can see this was a happy Earth, and this isn't such a happy Earth right now. So what is the Sustainocene? And when you think about the Earth and environment, you tend to think like this: green plants and a blue planet that looks very peaceful and happy. And that gives rise to environmental integrity and ecological sustainability. That's not what I mean by the Sustainocene. And by the way, that word comes from an Australian physicist, Brian Furness, who he just wrote to me yesterday. He's 88 years old, and he said he spent his whole life studying internal medicine. And now in his later years, he's turned to study external medicine. And the external medicine is that. But the Sustainocene is more than just this, because my argument is that can't exist if you have a big imbalance between the poor and the wealthy in the world. So if you have a lot of poverty, you can't have that type of world. And that's what the Sustainocene is. So when we talk about sustainability, we tend to always talk about the Earth, and we forget the other piece of the equation, which are people. And then when we talk about people, we talk about the people who have a lot, the wealthier parts of the world, and the part we forget about are the poorer parts of the world. And with a lot of poverty, you can't have this. And that's what the Sustainocene means. So the Sustainocene really is what type of things can you do to eliminate poverty. And then my contention is, and Dr. Furness's contention is, if you eliminate poverty, you can set a path to a sustainable world. Now, that's more of a sociology description. I'm a scientist, so what do scientists do? We wreck all these nice ideas with equations. So now I'm going to give you an equation to prove this concept of the Sustainocene. And so here's an equation where it's an identity equation, and it's energy used, and if I can calculate the amount of energy used if I know 3 variables. One is population, number of people. So you use energy, and you can calculate that, because I can calculate how many calories you ate over the course of a day. And if I know energy per unit time, that's power. So you're all wattages. When I look at you, you look like light bulbs to me. Okay? So I don't know if you've calculated how bright a light bulb you are, but on average, you're 100 watts. Geneva, people are a little bit brighter. They're around 102 watts, from what I can tell. They're much happier than America, we're 98. So you guys are doing well. So that's one piece, is how many people you are, because you use energy. But then there's a second piece, and that is money, or GDP per capita, because depending on what society you live in, the 100 watts is just to sustain yourself. Then there's an energy environment that grows up around you. If you're a wealthy country, you use a lot of energy. And that's because you have to manufacture things and you live a lifestyle that surrounds you. In America, in most developed Western civilizations that have big economies, that adds around another 1,000 watts per person. So you need 100, and there's another 1,000. So that's GDP per capita. And then this is energy per GDP. And that is called energy intensity. So say I want to grow an economy and I want to get to the corner. So I want to be a wealthy country and say this is high wealth. And I get up to here. And this axis here is energy. So how much energy do I use to get up to that corner? If I can get to the same level of wealth but use less energy, so I was up here, if I use less energy but keep the same amount of wealth, I've then conserved energy. So you can conservation isn't something that's a wishy-washy word, right? Conservation I can quantify by knowing how much energy you use in your societies to support your GDP. And if you multiply this equation together, that is up in the numerator, the top and bottom, they cancel, GDP cancels, and you're left with energy. So if I know population, GDP per capita, and energy intensity, I can calculate rigorously how much energy you need. And I did that a few years ago, and I just did it again. So it turns out you're using 16 terawatt equivalents of energy. So remember, watts is energy per unit time. So I don't want you worrying, is he talking about 1 week, a day, or a year? If you do energy per unit time, the way to think about this is the world in 2012 was burning a 16 trillion watt light bulb. The light bulb's on all the time, right? So you have a 16 trillion watt light bulb you're burning, and then you need to keep that light bulb on. And as you heard this week, you keep that light bulb on with coal, oil, and gas mostly. So if that's 16 terawatts, over 80% of it is coal, oil, and gas. That's how you keep the 16 trillion watt light bulb on. I can fast forward and look into the future and calculate how much energy you're going to need. And conservatively, you're going to need to keep a 30 trillion watt light bulb on in the next 35 years. So think of somebody young that you know and add 35 years to their life. And this is the world they're going to confront. Now, 16 and 30 doesn't sound like a lot. It's just 14 more of stuff. But I can, again, do calculations and start telling you how much total energy can you get out of different systems. So for instance, this one right here, if I want to get half my energy from nuclear, and by the way, I'm a fan of all of these. We can talk later of pluses and minuses. All of these are carbon neutral. So that makes me happy, and I like them all. But you should be scientific about it, take all the politics out of it. So when I say nuclear, what usually comes into everybody's head is politics and sociology. But let's not even do that, because scientists should just give data to people so they can make good decisions. So why do I say you'll have to build a nuclear power plant every 1.5 days forever, for eternity, to keep 8 terawatts of energy? And the reason is because when you build a nuclear power plant, you build a nuclear power plant at a gigawatt. You don't build them bigger, it's dangerous. So if I take 8 terawatts and divide it by a gigawatt, that gives you 8,000. Right? So that means you're going to need, in the next 35 years, 8,000 nuclear power plants. There's 200 days in a year, or 365 days in a year. So just say 400, 8,000 divided by 400. So you're going to be building a power plant every 2 days, 1.5 days, to get 8 terawatts. So you have to build me a new nuclear power plant in a day and a half. Then in a day and a half, you got to build another and another, and you got to do that for the next 40 years for me. And then I say forever because at the end of 50 years, you decommission nuclear power plants because they become old. So I'll let you, you're going to have to build me a new nuclear power plant for 40 years every day and a half. I'll give you a 10-year rest, and then you got to start rebuilding them all again. So that's what you get for 8 terawatts of nuclear. You decide if you want to do that or not. Biomass, that's 5 to 7 terawatts. I can take the fastest growing plants. I know how much they weigh, so I can take the entire arable earth, leave enough food to feed people, and then do a calculation and say how much is left over for energy. You get 6 terawatts. Photosynthesis is only 1% efficient, sunlight in to stored energy. Nobody told those poor plants 2.5 billion years ago they were supposed to evolve to be oil wells. Nobody told them that. They grew up to be plants, okay? And now we want to make them oil wells. So that's not fair. So don't blame photosynthesis. Wind, if you have wind, use it. But I can do an energy calculation for wind because you get 1% energy conversion. It's a mechanical scaling term. Because all wind, by the way, is solar. It's driven by the sun. And there's just not that much of it when you look globally at reasonable heights that you would be able to harvest it. Another way to say that, I can tell you all the science of the calculations, but if you can put your hand this easily through your energy system, it's not going to be a lot, I'll assure you. And so you can start adding this up, and now you start seeing that 14 terawatts is a lot of energy, because this is what these children are going to be confronting in the next 35 years. So that's why a lot of us like solar, and that's why this conference is on solar, because there's a lot of it. And it's everywhere. It's distributed. And there's actually 800 terawatts of practical, but in that paper that was mentioned, I did a calculation, and you can show that the amount of solar flux, 300, on average 200 watts per meter squared, the amount of sunlight hitting the face of the planet in one day is all the energy you use globally in a year. And you're not using it. You're not doing anything with it. So that's why a lot of people doing research now in energy are focusing so heavily on solar. The other thing is, if you've ever noticed, she follows you around everywhere, right? No matter where you are and who you are, whether you're poor or rich, you have the same access to it. And like I told the students on Wednesday, the high school students, I've never seen anybody get angry at the sun. So that tells me it's probably a good thing too. Did you ever see anybody getting angry at the sun? They always smile. So if you start adding it all up, it probably tells you you should be using the sun in the future. And I'm going to even prove that to you more as we move on. Now, when I did this energy calculation, there's one thing I had to do, I had to make an assumption for this energy intensity. So I had to make a guess how much energy you would be conserving in the next 35 years. I assumed that you were going to save every bit of energy you use today. So that's a tall order. I made an assumption that you will be saving, as a society, by 2050, 16 terawatts of energy. So if you aren't, say you save no more energy, you're not going to need 30 terawatts, you're going to need around 45 terawatts of energy, right? So you could start to wonder if you guys are doing the right thing, which is you're conserving all the energy you use today in 35 years. Why do you need so much energy? And that's because it has nothing to do with you. Remember my energy equation? That was scaling with population. And whether you know it or not, as I'm speaking today, there's 1.6 billion people who've never seen an electricity. They've never seen a wire, and they've never had access to any type of energy the way that you use it. So there's 1.6 billion 1.6 almost zero energy users on the face of the planet. There's 1.4 more low energy users, so there's 3 billion little to no energy use. And then in the next 35 years, there's going to be 3 billion of you showing up. So there's 6 billion new energy users coming, because those 3 billion are coming into the parts of the world where there isn't a lot of energy. That's where all the population growth is. So in the next 35 years, you're going to have 6 billion new energy users. And when you then run the calculation with those 6 billion people, you start getting to these huge astronomical numbers. And that's why I'm saying this has to do with the Sustainocene. If those people choose the energy system you have, and that, I should explain this word, legacy. Legacy means you've inherited your energy system. If you wanted to change it right now, you can't, because you have wires coming into your house. It's very difficult for you to change. So you have a legacy. You inherited your energy. These people don't have a legacy. They have to make choices for the future. If they choose your energy system, if you think you're having problems now with things like greenhouse gas and CO2, forget it in 35 years if they choose your energy system. So the challenge then is to eliminate poverty. There's another reason you want to eliminate poverty, because I keep making the assumption you're going to get to 10 billion people. When people acquire wealth and education, birth rates drop. So unlike what Jerry was saying, and by the way, this is the only positive feedback I can find in the energy argument. So as everything we do in energy, actually things get worse in terms of how we use energy today. This is the one positive. If I give poor people energy, actually I'll start stemming population growth. So it's a positive feedback loop. And the challenge is to get them the right flavor energy, not the energy we use. So that's why I went back and told you I can prove this idea of the Sustainocene. If you have 6 billion poor people using coal, oil, and gas, you'll never have a sustainable planet. And so the question, at least for us then, became, how do we start getting energy to the poor? And that's not how we do science. So I'm calling this frugal innovation. I have to innovate or make discoveries that are easy to implement and are low cost. That's typically not how we do research. Because the way we do research is we get money from the federal government or the state government or the city, and then we use that money to do research, and we're usually meeting the needs of the people who are giving us the money. The poor aren't giving us money. So we're blind to them. And when we get up in the morning, at least most scientists I know, don't get up with the idea that they should be doing research to help poor people. We're usually doing research to help our funder, who then needs to talk to their politician to say they had a good use of their money. And we live a pretty high lifestyle in the developed world. So most of our discovery is always making things more efficient and better. And my argument is more efficient and better always comes at high cost, right? And why I say that is because you have a lot of engineering. Engineering means you get big things and they are heavy. And my contention is you can't have cheap things if they're not lightweight and highly manufacturable. So why am I saying you have to do things that are lightweight and highly manufacturable to penetrate to the developing world, to the poor? And it's because of this. So let me explain how I do research. I don't even know how to use the instruments in my lab. My students do that. So I sit in my desk, and then I go on Google, and I make Google plots. And then I run into the lab, and I tell my students, look what I discovered. And I'm getting older now, so then they pat me on the head, they escort me back into my office, and they say, you just stay in there, and we'll keep doing important work for you. So that's how it goes. So since they won't listen to me, and you're a captive audience, you're going to have to listen to my new discovery, all right, my Google plot. So what I did is I took a Boeing 777, and I can look on Google and find out how much it weighs and then how much it costs. So I can take the cost and divide it by weight. And then I can find out in 2006, there were 74 Boeing 77s made. And then I can do that for other things like machines and automobiles. And look, I have a curve. That's what scientists look for. And so I can now predict how much something's going to cost to manufacture, right? And there's a few interesting things here. First, you can never be cheaper than $10 per pound. So whatever research you're doing, look at the target technology. You better be striving to get to $10 per pound, just the weight of the thing. So if you want to make fuel, for instance, I better develop a system that's less or weighs $10 per pound. I can never do cheaper than $10 per pound. That's from manufacturing engineering. The reason is most machines and things you build are built out of concrete and steel, and we know the price of those. When you start putting Intel chips in there, the price starts going up, right? So this curve won't work for computer chips. It doesn't work for pills, pharma, and it doesn't work for commodity chemicals, but it works for things that you build, and that you build at high manufacturing rates. And it works for everything. It works for this, okay? And I did this. I called McDonald's, and I said, what's the weight of the hamburger, the tomato, the lettuce, the bun, and the cheese? It comes out to $10 per pound. And they make infinite numbers of those, from what I can tell. So even a McDonald's hamburger now, I've equated to an automobile. Okay, isn't that interesting? Now, if you look at this, how do you guys build energy systems? You don't build them like this, you build them like this. You tend to build one system, like a power plant, and then you centralize it. It weighs a lot, so when you multiply by $10 per pound, it costs a lot. So a power plant will run you around $1.5 billion. So then what do? You set up a market, a model, a business model. So here's the business model. I'll invest $1.5 billion, that's my capital expenditure. Then I'll build it. I now have energy. I'll sell it to you. I'll set a price to recover my capital investment and make a profit. And then you just mess around with how quickly do you want to recover your capital investment. So that's the business model for energy systems. We build one big heavy thing, somebody owns it, and then you pay for it. And you pay for it because they put the money out there and took the risk of building it. So that's how we work. The equivalent, this is why the poor don't have energy systems, because they don't have any money after you give your capital expenditure and build the big heavy plant, so they can't pay you back. So we just ignore them. Thank goodness, or they would be doing what we're doing right now. right? The equivalent for McDonald's would be have one huge hamburger that everybody has to go to and take a bite out of it. So that would be the energy business model for McDonald's, right? But that's not how they do business. The way they do business is they have a very distributed business model. They make a lot of things. They're lightweight, $10 per pound, and they make a lot of them, and then they hand them out. So we're not very complicated, my research group. We looked and said, if that side of the graph isn't working, we then turned our eyes to this side of the graph. And the only thing, and this isn't going to sound very noble, the only thing I wanted to do was make the McDonald's hamburger of energy that I could hand out to everybody, and then they could use it. But it's got to be lightweight and highly manufacturable. So how do you make a McDonald's energy system that I could distribute? And just think about hamburgers. Everybody could use them, and they could then, sun is everywhere, so could I use the sun somehow with the McDonald's energy system? So that's what I'll tell you about tonight. What is something that does use the sun that's lightweight and it's distributed? And that's a leaf. So I'm just going to take a minute to explain this. I won't have too many chemical equations, but I'm a chemist, so you're going to have to see some chemical formulas. So here's sunlight coming into a leaf with water. Water is H2O, and there's hydrogen bonded to oxygen bonded to hydrogen. I'll show you in a minute. What the plant is doing, when you look at those plants, is it's taking the water and the sunlight and using the leaf, it rearranges the bonds of water to make hydrogen and oxygen. Now, you know that oxygen comes out of leaves. What you don't know is hydrogen is coming out of leaves because the plant doesn't let it go to a gas. It turns it into a solid form of hydrogen. In biology, it's called NADPH, but it's a solid form of hydrogen. The plant then takes that hydrogen and with carbon dioxide makes carbohydrate. So that's what you learn. Sunlight plus water plus CO2 makes oxygen and carbohydrate. What you probably didn't learn is all the solar energy is stored in this first piece of the reaction, the splitting of water to make oxygen and hydrogen. There is no energy storage once you have the hydrogen combined with CO2 to make sugar. The plants actually do that in the dark. They don't need sunlight to do that. So all the solar energy is stored in this simple reaction, splitting water to hydrogen and oxygen. So this is what you do when you burn a fuel or a carbohydrate. You have carbon, 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 hydrogen bonds and oxygen. These are high energy content bonds, just like hydrogen is a high energy content bond. You then just put it in CO2 and you still have that high energy content bond, but now it's carbon, hydrogen, and carbon, carbon bonds. Then you burn it. So when you get into your automobile and turn it on, this is the reaction that's happening, right? And there's your CO2 from gasoline. So you take the high energy bonds with oxygen, rearrange them, and you get low energy content bonds, carbon dioxide and water. And then you take the excess energy. So I'm going to do this for you once more, because this took 18 hours of PowerPoint to move these atoms around. So just watch it, just to make me happy, twice. Okay, so you get all the energy out from the rearranged bonds of oxygen and the fuel. What photosynthesis is doing is taking low energy content, like I told you, water, and then the leaf takes the sunlight and rearranges water to hydrogen and oxygen. And now you have the fuel. And then the fuel can be burned with oxygen again, and you get water back, but you get the energy back out. Right? So that's the whole cycle. Now, as was mentioned in the intro, this has been going on for 2.5 billion years, in case you don't realize it. So here's what I just talked about. This is the crystal structure of the photosynthetic membrane, which was just discovered in 2006. We got the picture of what is inside the plant. Jim Barber at Imperial College did that. So sunlight goes into the plant, and we rearrange the bonds of water to make oxygen and hydrogen. But I told you, it doesn't make H2. It keeps the 4 protons and 4 electrons, which is 2 molecules of hydrogen separated. Then it takes the hydrogen and CO2 and makes carbohydrate. You guys then eat the carbohydrate, right? Because that's what you do. You then breathe out the CO2 that comes out of your mouth. You keep the hydrogen inside you, not as a gas again, as the 4 protons and 4 electrons. And then you breathe oxygen in, and you have the anti-leaf in your body. In your mitochondria is an enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase. And it undoes everything the plant does. So it takes the O2 that you breathe, the hydrogen, which the plant put on the carbohydrate for you to eat. It then feeds the hydrogen and oxygen to your mitochondria, and that is what's called mitochondrial respiration. That's what's allowing you to live right now. Now, the remarkable thing here is, if I look on the left side and the right side, it's matter, and just do bookkeeping. The plant took water and split it to oxygen and hydrogen. It made the carbohydrate. So the plant made the carbohydrate, you ate the carbohydrate. So what was made on the left is gone on the right. You had the hydrogen from the splitting of water. That was combined with CO2. When you eat the carbohydrate, you breathe the CO2 out and you keep the hydrogen. So those things cancel. The water made the oxygen and hydrogen, but you're using the oxygen and hydrogen to run your mitochondria. They cancel. The water came in after you guys eat. You have water. It comes back out. Look there's nothing left over. So what happened then? There is one thing. What is the only new introduction of matter in the whole cycle? It's the sun. That's right, somebody just said it. So the only thing that is, if you look at it, it's sunlight in, cellular energy out. When you look at the entire system, the only thing you've added into this from the outside is sunlight. So whether you guys realize it or not, when you eat food, I don't know what you think you're chewing the sun. I'm serious. It's the only new mass in the whole cycle. And then you release the sunlight inside you, but not as a burst of sunlight. You do it in terms of a different form of energy. So the whole cycle is neutral in matter. It's just sunlight in, energy out. And you can't get your hands around the sunlight to power your body. So you have this huge, intricate system that developed over 2.5 billion years to allow you to eat the sun and then release it inside you. That's worked for 2.5 billion years. And then you guys, if you notice, I'm going to say that a lot, I've dissociated myself from humanity because we're making such dumb decisions, I don't even want to be associated with you guys anymore. So when I say you guys, and if there's a psychiatrist out there, don't worry, I have many cards that have offered to help my psychological instability, but I'm not going to change. So when I say you guys, I'm not being insulting, it's just I don't want to, because I know what we should be doing, okay? So that's worked for 2.5 billion years, and then society has decided to do a 150-year experiment and dig a bunch of stuff out of the ground. Now remember, it's still this cycle because photosynthesis put the fossil fuel in the ground. But you guys are doing it at a very accelerated rate. You use 1 million years of photosynthesis per year now. 1 million years of photosynthesis you put down there, you're releasing into the atmosphere. That's why you're having a CO2 problem, okay? Now, okay, so this all sounds horrible. By the way, most people think people who want coal, oil, and gas are conservatives, and solar energy are liberals. That's not true, because conservatives don't want anything to change. I want to use what's worked for 2.5 billion years. You can't get more conservative than me. The oil companies have been doing this for, they're liberals, and I'm the conservative in the solar argument. Now, why did photosynthesis do this? Because I've told you a bunch of bad news, if you think about it, in the next 35 years. So from here on out, I'm going to give you a path out of this mess, if you want it. If I take H2O to hydrogen and oxygen, I can calculate how much energy I get back out when I combine a hydrogen and oxygen. So if I take the Harvard swimming pool, that has 2.8 million liters of water. If I give you guys a McDonald's hamburger and you could catch sunlight and then operate on that pool of water to make hydrogen and oxygen per second. So globally, if the Earth could basically operate per second on a pool of water, now you're not going to use the water up, right? Because once you make the hydrogen and oxygen, when you recombine it, you get the energy back out. So we're storing the energy in hydrogen and oxygen. So while we're splitting it here in India, they split it already, they're reusing it. So we're just cycling, just like we did with the photosynthetic mitochondrial pathway, we're just cycling matter, energy in, energy out. You're not using up the water. So if I could just globally operate on one pool of water per second with solar light, how much energy could I store? Want to guess? Power now, energy per unit time. 38 terawatts. You only need 16. So I'm telling you, for 1/3 a pool of water globally per second with sunlight, I can take care of your energy needs. And it's totally sustainable. There's no byproducts. There's no CO2 going in the atmosphere. So that means at the end of the day, this is where you're headed. I just have no idea how long it's going to take you to get there. But like I told you, that's how the Earth has worked for 2.5 billion years. And you're going to go back to it at the end of the day. It's just a question of how long it's going to take you to get there. So this world is going to change into that world. And we're only talking about time now and how eager you are to get there. Right? Now, what I'm telling you is we need to do this. I need to still make a McDonald's hamburger. I haven't told you how to do that yet. And people have been talking about that for a long time, since 1912. Actually, Jules Verne had it in a novel in the mid-1800s. But this fellow, Chimichon from Bologna, if you go to the University of Bologna, you'll still see the Chimichon Institute. In 1912, he said if we could replace coal and oil with acquire a civilization based on utilizing solar energy, that would be happy. I told you, everybody smiles at the sun. To fix solar energy through suitable photochemical reactions with new compounds that unlock the guarded secret of plants. So people have been talking about this for 100 years. How does a plant work? And now, I'm not going to give you all the details of the biology. I'm going to talk about it as a systems engineer. Sunlight comes into the plant. The plant can't get its hands around photons. So in the way on its journey to splitting water to hydrogen and oxygen, when the sunlight comes in, it makes a wireless current. So an electron goes one direction, and if you have a negative charge in one direction, you have to balance the charge. A positive charge goes in the other direction. When you have moving charge, that's current. That's what happens when you put a wire in the wall. So the sunlight comes into the plant, and the first thing it does is it makes a moving current. But the current has no wires, so whether you realize it or not, leaves are buzzing with electricity. But there are no wires, okay? Then it takes those electrons, and it's got to do it 4 times. It's got to take the electron, with 1 unit of photons, a second, a third, and a fourth. It needs to do it 4 times because in the water splitting reaction, you need to move 4 electrons and 4 protons in that bond rearrangement. And that field's called proton-coupled electron transfer. It's a hard field because protons are classical, electrons are quantum mechanical, they spread out, so it's hard to get a classical Newtonian thing coupled to a quantum mechanical thing. And if you don't do it just right, you get a high energy barrier. So I will tell you, my group spent 20 years with lasers timing electrons and protons, and we figured out how to get them to speak to each other. So I'm not going to tell you that science. But that's what the plant in biology did over 2.5 billion years. Once it gets charged up 4 times with the sunlight, it splits water to oxygen and hydrogen. So we said, can we build something, and we'll do the same thing now. It's going to look like this, though, not like that. Sunlight's going to come in. We'll have 1 unit of charge. I'll do it 4 times. And then I have to make special catalysts that can collect this charge and do this proton-coupled electron transfer to split water to make oxygen and hydrogen. So we set out to do that. And the way we did it is we took a photovoltaic silicon on your solar panels. You have silicon in your solar panel. When the sunlight hits the solar panel, you're making a wireless current. So we said we'll put silicon between 2 conducting surfaces because we have to get the electrons out one side and the positive charge out the other side. And then we're going to invent new catalysts that work very efficiently to do this proton-coupled electron transfer, to split water to make oxygen and hydrogen. So we made this nickel, molybdenum, zinc, and we wanted to use earth-abundant things. We don't want really expensive materials, so I have to stay high in the periodic table. I can't use the elements that CERN worries about. They're too expensive. So I got to use light stuff you can dig out of the ground. And that's nickel, molybdenum, zinc. We did that. And then we made this compound, and that was the real key. Because in the first step, when you split water, the oxygen comes out and it leaves the 4 protons and electrons behind. So we made this compound. This compound's special. I don't want to get into the details. But this operates just like a leaf. It self-assembles. All you have to do is dissolve things in a glass of water. So if I put cobalt and phosphate in this water, I pass a little current through it. You don't need a chemist to build it. You could do this at home. This self-assembles. So we spent a lot of time figuring out how to make an oxygen evolving complex that would self-assemble. That's what happens in a plant. It takes manganese from the groundwater and self-assembles. It has the same building block. It's called the cubane. I won't go into that. The other thing is it's self-healing. It fixes itself on the fly. So because it's doing self-assembly, we can tell it and figure out the chemistry to make sure that if it starts to fall apart, it can refix itself by self-assembly. So this is the first self-healing catalyst ever made. A leaf is fixing itself every 30 minutes. It's fixing itself. Okay, so leaves are self-healing. This is self-healing. And then it does this PCET, proton-coupled electron transfer. So we spent a few years figuring all this out. And then we had the silicon. And this is a little more technical. There's 3 flavors of silicon. This is called amorphous silicon. Then we put some germanium in it and some more germanium, and another element. What that does is the top layer absorbs this light. The middle layer absorbs that light. The bottom layer absorbs that light. When you add all that up, that looks like the solar spectrum. So I can engineer the silicon to collect light over the solar spectrum. And then I need to split water, you need 1.4 volts of voltage, the current that we are making. So it has to be like a little battery, a 1.4 volt battery, but powered by the sun. So that puts out 1.4 volts. And once you have that, you can literally then you put your catalyst on the top and you put your catalyst on the bottom. In between, we put a little protective layer on silicon because silicon, Si plus O2 makes SiO2, sand. So if you take your silicon on your roof and you let it get oxidized, it will just fall apart to sand. So we had to protect the silicon. You can then take that little wafer, so this is just a wafer, silicon coated with these 2 catalysts. You can drop it in water, no special engineering, just drop it in. And now what's happening are the holes, the negative charge is going down, the positive charge is going up. It collects in that catalyst we made that's self-healing. You get 4 holes, it splits water to make oxygen, so the oxygen's coming off the front. The electrons went to the back side, and there's the other catalyst, and it's making hydrogen. And I don't have to keep fixing it, because what's going on at the surface is it's continually self-healing. You can use any water source. You can use a puddle on the ground. If I had to get clean water to the poor, I would be in big trouble. You can use urine. Now, why would you want to do that? 2 reasons. First, the student that was doing this work really irritated me. So I said, you're going to do the urine experiment. So they had to do that. But the other reason is, if you take urine and split it to O2 and hydrogen, when you recombine it, you get water, but it's pure. So now you have a way to start thinking about distributed clean drinking water, right? And so that's how it works. I didn't do that. I told you it would be like a hamburger. It's a hamburger. The silicon is the meat, the patty. The cheese is the ITO, the protective layer. The top bun is the cobalt catalyst. The bottom catalyst is the bottom bun. And this really is like a hamburger. If you have the silicon going by, all you have to do is spray coat it. I don't need an electrical engineer wiring everything up like you do in a solar panel. It's just coatings. And then drop it in water and just walk outside, hold it to sunlight, and it will start doing the photosynthetic reaction of water splitting to make hydrogen and oxygen. So it's highly manufacturable. It's just layers. There's no wires. It's exactly what we set out to do. And now you can just start handing these out to everybody. I will tell you, the one thing I don't like is that's amorphous silicon. There are no large commercial plants that make amorphous silicon. The stuff up on your roof is crystalline silicon. So just a few weeks ago, we figured out how to do this with crystalline silicon. So now we can do this with crystalline silicon. China is putting out a lot of crystalline silicon right now. And the prices dropped to less than $1 per watt. So now we can use a very highly manufactured silicon that's cheap. And we're up over 10%. Light in to hydrogen and oxygen. Now, remember, why not just use the solar panel? Because you can only use the solar panel when the sunlight's there. When the sun goes down, you don't have any more energy, but now you do. Because you've bottled the solar energy by storing it in hydrogen and oxygen. And with hydrogen and oxygen, you can then feed it at night to a fuel cell. That technology is already invented. So you can then give a fuel cell, and fuel cells take hydrogen on one side, oxygen on the other. They make water, and they generate electricity. So now you have the full cycle of water to hydrogen O2, energy in, sunlight, energy out, electricity to power your house, and then you get the water back. Now, the one problem here, and by the way, this is perfectly fine for me, but it's not for you guys. If I gave you a tank of hydrogen, you would say, what am I supposed to do with this? You'd probably blow up some balloons, maybe? I don't know what you would do with it. So you don't, at your house, you could have fuel cells, but you don't. What you know how to use is liquid fuels. So can you address that problem? And by the way, I'm totally happy here. But then you have people who want to commercialize this, and they say, oh, this is, an investor will say, oh, that's way too far down the road to get a new infrastructure that uses hydrogen. So then, instead of fighting them, the question is, can you make a liquid fuel? So this is something we haven't published yet. You're hearing it first. Is we took a bacteria called Ralstonia, and there's this new field of biology that's called synthetic biology. And the way that works, we now know what the human genome is. We're doing what's called genomics. We can map genes. So what we did, here's photosynthesis. Sunlight comes in, and it's this photosystem 2-in-1 where water splitting occurs, and you get the sunlight coming in. We went into Ralstonia with a colleague of mine at the Harvard Medical School, Pam Silver. And what we did is we said, put a hydrogenase in there. Hydrogenases are enzymes that take hydrogen, H2, to 4 protons and 4 electrons. So we put a gene in there that says make hydrogenases. So now the little bacteria breeds hydrogen, and it gives me 4 electrons and 4 protons. You can then put another gene in, the Calvin cycle. That's what's in the plant that takes CO2 plus hydrogen to carbohydrates or fatty acids. So we did that. And then you got to put some more genes in there to get it out of the bug. So you can now take the hydrogen that's coming off the leaf, use it in a fuel cell, or feed it to the Rostonia, the bacteria that have been genetically engineered to breathe in the hydrogen. They breathe in the CO2. They make the fatty acid. And then we do a little bit of chem engineering, because I can take 2 fatty acids. Fatty acids that's a fatty acid. If I eliminate this, CO2 comes out. Now that's okay. I'm not increasing CO2 because the CO2 was breathed in by the bacteria. So again, it's a mass neutral cycle. And then when you take the CO2 out, you have 2 pieces that get stitched together. You can actually use a membrane with the Coors family, Coors Tech. They have a membrane called Nasicon that can do this. So we're now able to take hydrogen that comes out renewably, CO2 from the air gets breathed in by the bug, and then we combine them and we're making liquid fuels. This thing is right now, as I speak, we haven't even published it yet. I'll publish or write a paper in a few weeks. It's working at around 1.5% to 2%. So it's a creaky old machine, and we'll figure out how to make it better. Finally, just to end, the world I'm talking about is still a long way away from where you're living, because you, like I said, don't know how to deal with hydrogen, even this artificial leaf. We could put the solar panel up there, I could engineer it for you, but that's not how homes are built. The way this part of the world works, like I said, is your energy is at a power company. Now, if you generate solar energy on your roof, you have electricity to run your house. You could also sell the electricity back to the power company. The problem now is they can't store it. What I just talked about was an energy storage mechanism in photosynthesis. I'm storing solar energy in a chemical fuel. They could have the artificial leaf at the power station, or what they like more is a battery, because they could store the electricity from your solar panel if they had a good battery. And then at night, they could sell it back to you and make a profit, set up one of those business models. And then the market works. All of a sudden, if they can store electricity, energy becomes a commodity for them. They can trade and sell it. And then it's to their benefit for you to have a solar panel on your roof. Because if you have a solar panel, you'll be generating electricity for them that they can sell at night and make a profit. So my argument, a general theme of this talk is, it's not generating electricity from the sun. That's not the problem. The problem is we don't know how to store it. And this storage mechanism is how you live in this world. So what do? So what we did a few years ago, there was a company I started that was working on the artificial leaf, and then you get all these investors going, oh, this sounds great, no, sir, except we're not giving you any money. That's too far out in the future. That's investors. You know what they want to invest in? Fracking. They like fracking, okay. So then what you say is, all right, instead of fighting them, again, trying to convince them, say, what do they like? And they like electricity. And so what we came up with is a thing called a flow battery. And this is how a flow battery works. There's 3 pieces. There's a piece that has an electrode, which collects the electrons, the electricity. Then you have what's called balance of plant. You have to pump. So what we're going to do is take a glass of water here, or a tank of water here, and a tank of water there. And then I'm going to put some compounds in it, something we invented. We'll put the compounds in there. And then we're going to charge them up with sunlight. So I'm going to put a compound in here and a compound in there. It's called coordination compounds. So we put some coordination compounds in there. The electron is over here. when the sun comes out, what I can do, I have now energy coming from the sun. I can force the electron from this side to this side. So now what I've done is I've put sunlight in an electrical stored current. But they're compounds dissolved in water, not like the batteries you're used to. Then at night, the sun goes down. So the electron's sitting over here, but it wants to go back because that's the low energy state. So what happens at night, the electron goes back, but in between, I'll use the electrons and send them back to you. So the way this would work is you would use solar electricity, send it to the power company. They have the flow battery. They charge it up. Then at night, they send this flow, one glass of water, over the electrode, take the electrons out, and then sell them back to you at night. And the difference about that type of battery versus the one that's in this laser pointer or any battery you know, if you want more energy, you need a bigger battery, and that gives you more power. So energy and power are combined. In this system, say the power company is going to have a big increase in electricity. They don't have to go and build this system here. All they need to do is get a bigger tank to put more stuff in to store more electrons. So the important thing about these flow batteries is they decouple power density from energy density. They're decoupled. And so a year ago, we made this special sauce right here that we could dissolve in 2 glasses of water. And we built a prototype. And that thing works at 10 kilowatt hours. The average person in Europe uses 25 kilowatt hours in a day. So you could take this flow battery, put it in your basement, charge up during the day from your solar panel, so you could be distributed. And then at night, you could get the electricity back. But then you might say, I don't want to be dealing with this. That's more hardware, and I'd rather have the power company do it. So the power company is not going to deal at 10 kilowatts. They're going to be dealing at megawatts to hundreds of megawatts. And that's not something we can do. But I will tell you, if you look over here, 10,000 hours, safe, 80%. In this battery, if it were a catastrophic failure, you would just need a mop to mop everything up, okay? And the chemicals we used were all FDA-approved chemicals. There's nothing that's dangerous about this. So in August, late August, I needed a big partner, and I'm not a great business person. I'm going to tell you, I'm a dorky scientist. I basically I just took care of my original investors and then gave everything to Lockheed Martin, one of the largest engineering companies in the world. And they're now scaling this thing up to go to market within 3 years. And they're going to be looking to put these at power companies. And once the power company has it, power company is going to they'll help you put solar panels on your roof. So that's important, because you can't fight markets, right? So this is now happening. The beauty of this is that's the world you're living in at the power company. But like I said, we already have a prototype that works for an average house in Europe or America. And so you could imagine having a house in a small Indian village hooked up as a microgrid. So the house has the flow battery, and then all the little houses are just connected to it. So you could go either this macro grid, what you guys already have in the ground, or you could go this microgrid setting. No matter what way you skin it, whether I'm talking about a flow battery or an artificial leaf, if you think about what I'm saying, you have very distributed energy with sunlight. And so your house will become its own power station and gas station. Remember, with hydrogen, you can put hydrogen in a fuel cell car and drive off out of your garage. So that is your future. And it's photosynthesis. It's splitting water to hydrogen or oxygen, or the flow battery, where we don't go the whole way to the chemical fuel, we only make electricity. The bad thing about batteries, though, is they don't store as much energy as a fuel. That's why you guys like petrol, gasoline, because it stores 1,000 times more energy than a battery. So I like fuels, and I think that's where you'll end up going. But on the way, we have this transition technology to kickstart solar, both in a distributed and at a power company level. So we've done this before. You, in the 70s, used to have things called mainframes. So remember, IBM had computers, and then they would sell you the data. They would have the big computer and sell you the data. That's what a grid does. They have the electricity, and then they move it to you. Then these things showed up. And that's all I'm saying. What you've done in computing, you can do in energy. And you just use the sun to do it. And the important thing is not only that your home will be a power station and gas station, but that, because you remember the equation, energy scales with GDP, gross domestic product. So if you can get energy to the poor, you start giving them wealth, because they can make things and manufacture things. So the nice thing about this model is you put the rich and the poor on an equal footing. So that's what I wanted to tell you about. Everything I just told you about, every day we got up to do the research, it was saying, what do we invent? I didn't tell you about all the inventions because I didn't want to give you a chemistry lecture. But what do you invent to make sure that you minimize engineering and minimize cost? And that means only have the essence of what you need and get rid of all the rest of the stuff that surrounds it. And so that's what we call frugal innovation. That's equivalent to the Sustainocene. And then keeping with the hamburger motif, if you do this, you can serve not 1 million people like McDonald's, but 7 billion people. And more importantly, the 6 billion of the future who will be determining your energy future. So thank you.
I think the response of the audience says enough. Donc, c'est maintenant la période où vous pouvez poser des questions, si vous en avez. Des questions seront récoltées et le panel d'experts ici présents va y répondre. Sinon, vous pouvez filer à l'onglet. Donc, on recommence dans 5 minutes environ. I think we can start the questions now. We have quite a lot of questions, so that we don't finish too late. The first question here is a simple one. How do you separate hydrogen and oxygen?
Yeah, if you notice, hydrogen was being made on this side, and oxygen was being made on this side, so they're already separated. You just have the hydrogen come over there and the oxygen come over there. My movie was not a very bright movie because I was letting them mix up here. But if you were to build a technology, you wouldn't do that. You would just put a compartment here and just let the hydrogen bubble out on this side and the oxygen bubble out on that side. So they're already separated.
And the other question from the same person, can you get pure silicon for 16 billion people?
Silicon is SiO2, and that's sand, and we know how to make sand to silicon. So the question is no problem with the amount of silicon on the face of the planet for 6 billion people or 10 billion people. It gets down to the same thing with oil. It's production, because you have to have a high rate of production. China has decided they are going to be the owners of silicon, and in the last few years they've built 5 mega plants in China to start churning out silicon. And one of the companies is called Hanergy, if you know about silicon. So the Chinese will be delivering a lot of silicon. That has been the reason why a few years ago silicon was $4 per watt. It's now down to $1. last year, at certain points, it hit 24 cents, because it just depends on how fast the Chinese are going to produce it. So no problems with the silicon.
We have some questions here which are all more or less in the same sense. Tim, how much does an artificial leaf cost, and how many years will it take to commercialize it?
Right. So, how much does it cost? This is I'm going to answer this in a different way. If you bought a gallon of gasoline, so it was around 4 liters of 4.5 liters of gasoline. It costs, you can think of the cost of that. 1 kilogram of hydrogen is equal to 4.5 liters of gasoline. That leaf, with the cost of silicon right now, would be making hydrogen at around $4 per kilogram of hydrogen, which is a gallon of gasoline. So it's in the ballpark, because that's how much you're spending already. And that has all the costs roped into it. The problem is you don't have a hydrogen infrastructure, and you got to build that. And that's extra cost that's outside of the artificial leaf. And that's why we went and built the flow battery, because I got tired of everybody saying but, and then they always have this cost question. So it's affordable, but you don't want to build a new infrastructure because you're using your one you have now that you already paid off. So that's what makes it expensive, not the thing itself.
Another question, do you know anything about how original photosynthesis evolved?
Yes.
What?
So that's been studied. It's with aerobic respiration. And then it was these sorts of genetic mutations so that's a very well-studied field. And now with genomics, people can track it back. But it was organisms were living in an anaerobic world, no O2. Then O2 showed up. And then life forms started changing, and it's sort of it's a slower version of what the synthetic biology was. And it's like any evolutionary process. So the key was the appearance of oxygen that drove photosynthesis, the development of photosynthesis. The really important point is since 2006 with the crystal structure of Jim Barber, and then 2 years ago, the Japanese came out with a super high resolution crystal structure. We're now really understanding how photosynthesis works and functions, and it's because of that we were able to get to this artificial leaf so quickly, because we really understand the function of photosynthesis now.
We have one question from last night's talk, but I think it is, they talk about greenhouse gases are composed of at least 80% water, but you didn't mention that.
Yeah, so water vapor is actually a very powerful greenhouse gas. When we burn coal, oil, and natural gas, one of the byproducts is carbon dioxide, which itself is a greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide occurs naturally in the air. If we didn't have any carbon dioxide in the air, the temperature of the planet would be near freezing. So you need these very small amounts of carbon dioxide in the air to trap enough heat to allow life to exist on the planet. So just by adding just a very tiny amount of CO2, relatively speaking, by burning fossil fuels, you increase the background level that's already very small of CO2, but just increasing that little bit provides enough additional heat trapping capabilities to warm up the planet. When you start warming up the planet by increasing greenhouse gases like this, you start warming up the oceans. The oceans then increase evaporation. That's more water vapor in the air. So you have more water molecules in the air. Water vapor is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and so you amplify the original effect. This is one of these real positive feedbacks that you identified just one of in the energy world, but The climate system is full of various feedbacks, positive and negative. So this is a positive feedback, which means it amplifies the warming. So by warming up the system, you release more, you evaporate more water off the warmer oceans, you get more water vapor in the air, that traps more heat, that heats up more water, and you just kind of go in a positive feedback loop like that. So water vapor is a very powerful greenhouse gas and a very important part of the climate change story.
I just want to say, though, because people get confused by this, yes, water is a greenhouse gas. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. There's a massive amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and then the plants breathe it in, and you're under dynamic equilibrium. And then in the last 150 years, you're letting out 1 million years of photosynthesis. So the way I like to explain it to people, and it's a very small percentage on the big percent, but this is the way I explain it to people. You eat food, and then you try to burn all those calories. You don't want to accumulate them. But let's do a thought experiment. In 1 year, if you're 200 pounds, you just save 1%. So 1% more CO2 goes in. You save 1% of your weight extra. So the next year, you're 202 pounds. The next year after that, you're 204 pounds. Do the calculation and find out how much you weigh at 30 years. And that's what you're doing with CO2. You're accumulating it, and you're becoming fat on CO2. Even though you're taking a lot of calories in and you're expending them. It's that little bit extra which confuses people.
2 questions about how much it costs to produce the catalytic parts of the device, and metals like nickel, molybdenum, and zinc. These are not renewable resources.
Well, there's more nickel in your pocket right now than I need for my catalyst. Those catalysts, so the important word here is catalyst. A catalyst isn't used up or made. It just sits there and it churns away. So you're not using it up. The nickel is in the first row, and there's plenty of nickel, there's plenty of molybdenum, there's plenty of zinc for the amount of catalysts I'm using. That coating is only 100 nanometers thick. So you have way more nickel on all your money than I'm going to need for this problem right here.
Yeah, I might also add that molybdenum is a rare element, but everybody here has about 2 or 3 milligrams, so I think we have about 1 kilo. No, we have a few grams here tonight. And nobody here is very, very rare to find molybdenum shortage, so it's not that rare. How does the efficiency of your leaf compare with a real leaf?
I'm really beating the heck out of real leaves right now. So right now, when I said 10%, I want you to understand what that number is. It's sunlight into stored energy. The fastest growing plants are 1%, called switchgrass, storage and carbohydrate. Algae can get to 5%. That's why you hear about algae. But then you got to keep these things living. So over your fastest growing energy plants like switchgrass, we're already 10 times better. And we're tied to the efficiency of silicon. So I'm using silicon that's 12%, and then everything that I talked about, all that chemistry, is running at 80%. So it's 80% of 12%, which is 10%. If I used a 20% silicon cell, I'd be 16%, 16 times better than photosynthesis. And it's because these materials are dead, and those plants, like I told you, well, not those plants. Those plants are done. But regular plants, remember, they're using a lot of energy to live. They didn't know they were supposed to be storing it. So they're very efficient energy machines, but they're not efficient at storing energy. So we're way better than a plant.
Another question is, fuel cells often involve metals like platinum. Is fuel cell technology that efficient and cheap?
Yeah. So fuel cells are very efficient relative to your internal combustion engine. They're twice more efficient. They run at 60%. Your engines run at 30%. It has platinum. So one big research effort in the world today is to replace platinum with cheaper metals, like I showed you with cobalt and nickel. So that's one path of research. If you were to go to a full energy system, you would not want to be using platinum in fuel cells. So that's another research endeavor that the energy community is working hard on globally right now, is to replace the amount of platinum in a fuel cell. One interesting thing which people haven't been paying attention to, some of the biggest automakers have announced that they're going to become fuel cell-based car companies in the next 10 years. The reason for that is a lot of homes are going to be getting natural gas because of fracking. And you can take methane plus water in one step, make CO2 and hydrogen. And so their business model is you'll be having natural gas coming in to heat your house. They're going to make a little washing machine sized box or smaller, which is called a reformer, to take some of that methane and make hydrogen and then pump it into your gas tank, which is a hydrogen tank, and you're going to drive out of your house. So when I'm telling you your home's going to be a gas station, it's coming quicker than you realize because of fracking and natural gas. The problem is natural gas puts out CO2, but initially you don't care because you're going to, hydrogen from fracking is $1.50. I forgot to mention that. So the artificial leaf sounds great, $4.50. When I started the project, that's what it was around 5 years ago. Because of fracking, it's down to $1.50. So that's made the car companies say, hey, we could just take methane to hydrogen and put it in the car, and people just refuel their cars at their homes. So Toyota, Honda, you can go read about it in the newspaper. That's what they're thinking.
Can you say anything out? There was a project of Siemens for a big solar installation in the Sahara. Do we know?
Yeah. So that's called solar thermal. So you could centralize solar. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can centralize solar. So I could take all the sunlight and make a big solar farm, and then there's a few things you could do with it. One thing you could do is make electricity, but another thing you could do is heat a fluid, and once you have hot fluid, so I take the sunlight, I focus it, I heat a bunch of fluid, and then I can send the fluid and use that heat to run turbines, and that can generate electricity. So that is a centralized model of solar. If you have a big desert and nobody's using it, that's why people are interested in this. Spain has big solar farms, and it's a different mechanism than I'm talking here. It's to actually take the heat of the sun, heat a liquid, and then run a turbine. And by the way, this isn't an end-all, this distributed. If you live, this isn't going to work very well in a high-rise building in New York City, right? Because you have a lot of people in a small box. So you shouldn't be doing this. Then you should use electricity coming off the grid, and it could be solar electricity. So, you know, it all starts to dovetail, or you use solar electricity off of roof panels, sell it to the electric company, and let them sell it to the big high-rise building using a flow battery. So that's why we did the flow battery, so I could not always get attacked for what do you do if you live in a high-rise. Now I can tell you what to do.
You've convinced one person who says, why aren't people using your system more?
Because you really don't care as a population yet to take care of this problem. We're still putting a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's cheaper, and we aren't highly motivated. So, you know, in America, there are people, politicians, who will say publicly they don't believe in climate change. They really believe in climate change when you talk to them privately. Almost all of them do that I've met. But it comes at cost, because the simple answer to this question is, why aren't you using it? If you started adding up the amount of money for your current energy system, your legacy, you've inherited it, it's over hundreds of trillions of dollars. You've built power plants, you've put wires in the ground, you have railroads to deliver coal, you have oil tankers. Add up the full cost of all of that, and you already paid it off as a society. And what you then want are a bunch of scientists to invent something and try to displace hundreds of trillions of dollars of investment. So that's not going to happen with the snap of a finger. And that's when you get into things that Jerry worries about with climate change, because he does a lot with policy people. Should you price carbon or not? And he can speak about that. But the easiest thing right now would be to start putting pricing carbon. That's called a tax, but in America you can't use that word because of the Tea Party. So we call it pricing. But you could start generating revenue to start accelerating the discovery, but nobody has the political will right now, from what I can tell. And I'm sure Jerry can speak more authoritatively.
Yeah, you want to say something? No. Last question. There is still life beneath hundreds of meters of rock where the sun isn't getting.
Yep.
How does it manage from the point of view of energy?
Yeah. So those are organisms. Remember I told you there was life on the planet that didn't use oxygen? And so, for instance, if you go into deep vents in the ocean, they use things like sulfur from hydrogen, and they use methane. So there are other ways that you can get energy, but the important point there is those are fuels. They're already high energy content fuels that those organisms are using in the deep ocean. But when oxygen showed up, there was the aerobic part, and there is an anaerobic part, and there's different type of energy cycles for that. So one solution is that we all become anaerobic and move underground.
Okay, I think we've come more or less to the end of the questions. I'm sure that we could carry on for hours, but I think we started off with the universe. We've ended up 100 meters below Earth, below the surface of the Earth. You have seen, I think, many aspects of the sun that you didn't see before. So I think we can all thank very much the Wright Foundation and Georges Menet, who's been the guiding force here. And also, we thank you for coming and showing your interest in science. Thank you. Il n'y a pas grand-chose pour vous, je crois.